Hi, welcome to this session of our EpiDoc training program, for which you can see a link at the bottom of the screen. And in this session, Gabriel Bodar is going to show how to mark up words in EpiDoc and how to deal with lemmatization. So please, Gabby.
Thank you very much, Irene. So yes, I'm going to talk a bit about an optional feature of EpiDoc encoding. This is something that many projects don't encode, but if you want to manually and explicitly record the word content and the indexable part of that word content, that is to say the head words or the lemmater of the words, then here are some tips for doing so. I'm going to talk about the concept of tokenization and tagging, which is a part of that concept, lemmatization, and then also dealing with incomplete words and dealing with word tags that overlap with other words, which we've talked about a little bit in an earlier tutorial, but I'll recap that briefly today. So to start off talking about tokenizing, we need to go back to the inscription. So here is a Latin inscription, and I'm particularly interested in this line, line 2. And as we all know, or at least anyone who's dealt with Greek and Latin epigraphy knows, there would be no spaces between words on the stone. So if we were transcribing this in a diplomatic way, that is just transcribing what we see, we'd write something like this. Okay, so there are three words at least in here, but an ancient reader would have totally recognized this as 3 words, and they wouldn't have thought there was anything odd about them being run together. But we feel much more comfortable if we can put spaces between those words to be able to read them. And this is what we call tokenization. It's explicitly marking a string of characters into individual tokens. And in a traditional epigraphic edition, this is exactly what we do, or papyrological edition. We simply tokenize the text by adding spaces between the words, and we also do things like putting them into lowercase and so forth to make them easier to read, and so that we can have mixed case, we can have uppercase for proper names and all the rest. If we want to be a little bit more explicit in the tagging of words in our epigraphic text, either because we want to say something more about the words, or because we want to make sure that they don't get confused and broken when other markup is interspersed in the middle of it, or if, because as in some languages, the presence of space in the text does not always coincide with word divisions. Some texts have multiple words grouped together without spaces, and spaces are used for other kinds of information. Then we might want to tag those word breaks more explicitly with the use of this W tag. And the word W simply means word, and it means word in the loosest possible grammatical sense. That is to say, whatever sense something is a word in your linguistic tradition, you can use the W tag to record word in that sense. So you could, for example, use word to separate what we think of as a single unit with no spaces, that is the main word and an enclitic together. You could use W tags to separate those out without adding a space in the middle of them. To this word tag, we can then add various attributes to give more information about the word if we choose to. The most obvious one, which we can use to help with indexing, is the lemma attribute, and we can use the lemma attribute to put in the nominative singular or first person singular, present, active, indicative, etc. form of a word. In order to, which would be the dictionary head word, in order to generate the index from that, as shown in this slide. It is possible, although I have to say I've never seen anybody do it, to use an authority, internal or external authority list of word forms, in other words, a dictionary, to lemmatize the text. So you could do something like this. You could have, there's an attribute lemmaref, which rather than taking a string of characters, takes a pointer to a an online dictionary of some kind. And so, as for example, the Perseus version of the Lewis and Short dictionary that's being pointed to here, to point precisely to those lemmated, to those headwords. You could also choose to have your own dictionary that either has a smaller vocabulary or a more specific vocabulary to your corpus or so forth, and point to them also from lemmaref, but as an internal link instead. But as I say, most people have, in my experience, anyone who has indexed words, in my experience, has done so by simply putting the form of the word in a lemma attribute, as in our example, and the index is generated from these forms in the lemma attribute as unique forms, rather than from an authority list for words. It's pretty much the only index that involves, you know, words or names or similar that we would almost never use an authority list to generate. So that's all about tokenizing and lemmatizing words. A few other features that you might want to tag about your words. So incomplete words is one. So I'm going to use another epigraphic example. This one is a Greek example, a little bit hard to read, but the line I'm interested in is this one highlighted here, and it's particularly those last three characters on that line, which, as you can see from the editorial transcription, says it's a word that begins with the characters epi. And because epi is a very common prefix, it can be a preposition in its own right, but in this case, we've decided it must be a prefix to a word. It could be almost any word. Okay, so we know that it's the first three letters of a word, but there's no point in attempting to guess what word it is. There are thousands and thousands of words that begin with the prefix epi possible in ancient Greek. So we tag the words, and epi is the string of characters, the only characters in this edition that make up that word. So we tag that as if it were a complete word for the moment, and there's a gap immediately after it. That represents those square brackets and dashes in the line. And I'm not going to represent all the attributes needed for gap, because that's not the purpose of this discussion. But imagine that the gap says reason lost, extent unknown, unit character, and any other things that gap might have encoded on it. However, we do want to make clear that epi here is not the preposition epi, but is an incomplete word. That's clear to any philologist looking at this, because there's no accent mark on there, but to a computer, that's not necessarily clear. So we can lemmatize all of the other words. We can't lemmatize epi because it could be almost anything. Instead, we say epi is only part of the word. And which part of the word is it? It's the initial part. And here's the possible values you can use on that attribute part: initial, final, medial, yes or no. In practice, we never use no, so I've got that grayed out, because if you mean it's not a part, you just don't use the part attribute, right? It's the default value of the attribute that it's only there to show what it would mean if it were absent. So here's a different example with part equals f. So this is the characters ona. They're clearly the end of a word, but it could be the end of dozens of different words. So there's a gap before it, but we also have the part equals f attribute on there. And note that I'm always quite careful when I'm using these tags to leave no white space in the XML between the gap and the word that is partly lost in that gap. That again helps with the display, because that's something you would be used to seeing. If there's a space after a letter and before a square bracket, you would tend to assume that means the word is complete in a Leiden edition. Not everybody uses it in that way, but that would be my assumption, and that's why I'm quite careful to reflect that in the XML as well. The third kind of incomplete word is a string like this. You've got the characters tagm. That's clearly the middle of a word of some kind, but there could be several different words that it could be. So there's a gap both before it and after it, and we use part equals m, meaning it's the medial part of that. The other value, by the way, the value yes, is only useful potentially if you say this is part of a word. We can tell this is not a complete word, but we can tell that the characters here are clearly running together as part of a word. I couldn't swear that they're the beginning of the word or the end of the word or the middle of the word there, but they are clearly not a complete word. So you could just say yes, meaning part, if you're not sure which of the first three to encode it as. That's pretty uncommon, but you could encode that if you wanted to. The other kind of incomplete word is where not that there's anything lost necessarily, but you have, for example, an abbreviation or some other word that is not completely written out. And because of the lack of context, or because of the lack of your understanding of it or similar, you can't be sure exactly what ending to put on it. This is particularly useful in inflected languages like Greek and Latin, where we can pretty much tell that this is the word veteranus, but we don't know what case it's in. So we expand the abbreviation as usual, but we add around it, we add the W tag with a part equals I. And that hyphen in the Leiden is what is represented by the part equals I in the markup there. And so my final point is about the complex lacunae. We've talked about this in an earlier presentation, but I just want to make a slightly more general point about this. So we have here a string of characters which is largely restored, but you can see that the various restorations overlap the divisions in the words. So the hypers is supplied, and then riaske is supplied, and the rest is on the stone or on fragments of the stone. Which means, and note again that this should be supplied reason equals lost, but so as not to clutter up the slide, I'm assuming we all know that attribute is there, and leaving it out for this example. If we were to tag the words in here as well, we would have a slight problem, right? We've tagged the supplied where there were square brackets in the Leiden. We've tagged the words where there are words in the text, and as soon as we've typed this into our XML editor, all this red underlining appears because we have a W tag here, a W element, which is closed, which is not closed before the supplied element around it closes. So the error will say, W must be closed by a W tag, because here it looks like the W is being closed by the supplied tag, and here it looks like the supplied is being closed by a W tag, and here again a W tag being closed. So it's all a complete mess. This is, as you know from XML 101, right at the beginning of these tutorials, you cannot have overlapping tags in XML. So instead, we have to break it up into in some way. And what I always recommend is that we break up the supplied tag, because the word tags are useful to have them as intact, because they are semantic tags. We are saying this is a complete word, and that has implications for indexing, but it also has implications for grammatical analysis and syntactic analysis and so forth. And if we wanted to point in from, for example, an external tree banking file or something like that, we need to have a tag that groups together the entire word. Whereas the supplied tag, although it's represented by solid square brackets in Leiden, is in a sense an arbitrary tag where it is. You could say that each individual letter is supplied and it would still be true. So semantically, it seems to me that this is a much more correct way to encode this. We do then get the issue that a naive rendering of that would put these square brackets where I've put them in red here, which are square brackets we don't want to see in the Leiden. But as we explained in the other presentation, the standard XSLT, the style sheets that EpiDoc makes available and that are used by FS knows to omit those square brackets when they're not wanted. I should just note that some people who use different tools for rendering and publishing their EpiDoc prefer to do it the other way around. They prefer to break the word and not break the supplied, because the supplied will tell you where to put the square brackets, and the words, you know, can be linked together. You can use part and part equals I on the first half, part equals F on the second half, and something linking the two to tell the processor that that's a single word. And for indexing, that can be adequate. It strikes me that that's a bit more cumbersome, but if your publishing medium is not as elegant as the EpiDoc style sheets, that or in this particular respect doesn't handle these in quite as elegant a way as the EpiDoc style sheets does, then you could certainly see a reason for encoding the supplements as the primary thing to encode, and the words are something that you can break up. And as I say, some corporate don't tag words at all, so they don't have this issue. So in summary, just a few notes about the W tag. The W element represents a grammatical word, which is not necessarily an orthographic word, as I've said. The attributes available that we've talked about are lemma, which is the most common one we use for the uninflected head word, can also be used as the identifier. That is the string that you index. The lemma ref can be used as a pointer to a dictionary, which defines and gives you the head word for that word. There's also a POS attribute, part of speech. I've not seen this used, but you could in theory use it to say, I want to say this is a noun, I want to say this is some other part of speech and other kinds of grammatical information. And there's the part attribute, which I've talked about. This is saying that this word is incomplete in the addition. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's incomplete on the stone, although it may well be, but it means that it's incomplete in this edition, and that's what the part is saying. And just my final point is, I would always break other tags that overlap with words rather than breaking the W tag, if at all possible. And I would strongly recommend that you follow that principle as well if you are using XSLT, if you're using particularly the EpiDoc reference style sheets or FS. But in any case, if you're using XSLT to render your inscriptions, you're going to find life much easier if you keep words intact and break other things instead. That's all I have to say about that. Anything you think should be added, Irene? Do you want to defend people who want to break words?
No, it's fine.
Okay, fine. Thank you then.